We urge those within the regime, including those who have been sanctioned, to distance themselves from the violence and the dictatorship. President Trump made it clear the status quo is unacceptable. Today's actions is the next step towards freedom for the Venezuelan people.
Sanctions have hit Venezuela once again, this time from both sides of the Atlantic. The US and the European Union are imposing new restrictions on the crisis-hit country. After a contentious election earlier this year, 10 more Venezuelan officials have been targeted by Washington. They're accused of undermining democracy through corruption. Meanwhile, the EU is set to impose an arms embargo, but Venezuelans are already suffering. With food and medicine hard to come by, many are starving, some even to the point of death. So, are sanctions really the answer? Will they force President Maduro's hand, or just give him more ammunition to blame the West for his country's problems? Well, to answer some of these questions, we're joined now by Jeff Ramsey. He's a Venezuela expert at the Washington office on Latin America. Jeff, good to talk to you. It's not just the US, it's also it's not just the US, it's the EU and Canada as well. Are these sanctions a good idea?
Well, I think it's a bit more complex than that. You know, I think it's certainly true that we've seen the Venezuelan government use targeted sanctions against its own officials to sort of cultivate a loyal core of officials. And in that way, I think U.S. sanctions are sort of shooting themselves in the foot. On the other hand, I do think that the recently announced arms embargo is a positive thing. I think an eventual civil war in Venezuela or some kind of internal armed conflict needs to be taken very seriously. And I think that preventing arms transfers to Venezuela is a very important step.
Does it matter that even if you can empirically prove that these sanctions only target specific individuals within the Venezuelan government, they're undoubtedly going to use it as a rhetorical point to say the imperialists are targeting us, and the reason you're starving is because America and the West are sanctioning us. And that could even be extended to the arms embargo you're talking about, is to say, well, the opposition's getting arms from America or elsewhere, and we're not allowed to actually protect ourselves. So does it actually matter whether it's true or not, the fact that they might use this?
Well, that's certainly a concern that we have, you know, and we've seen the Venezuelan government sort of take these sanctions and, you know, these officials that have been on these targeted sanctions lists have been honored, and in many cases they've been promoted. The recently announced Minister of the Economy in Venezuela, this guy named Serpa, was promoted after being added to a sanctions list. And that's happened in other cases as well. Back in July, when 13 officials from various government ministries were added to the sanctions list, the very next day, President Maduro held a ceremony and awarded them replicas of the sword of Simon Bolivar, a national hero. So it's certainly you know, something that the government has been trying to use to sort of rally its base and sort of, again, cultivate this loyal core of officials.
Yeah, interesting. The foreign minister or Minister for Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, Jorge Ariaza, after Canada's sanctions, saying the government of Canada on Twitter, with the pretensions of empire, intends to impose illegal actions against the institutions and citizens of Venezuela. The sad role that the Canadian government has come to play under absolute and shameful subordination to the government of Donald Trump. You say they're using it to rally the base. Does it actually work? Does the base actually rally behind them?
Well, that's the interesting thing. I mean, Maduro is extremely unpopular. You know, Venezuela is going through triple-digit inflation. There's widespread shortages of basic goods and medicine. But he still maintains the support of 15 to 20% of the population. And I think that's certainly something that he's trying to capitalize on with these sanctions, is, you know, showing that, you know, we are under threats and it's time to hunker down and do everything we can to protect ourselves from the so-called imperialist threat. But, you know, I also think that it's pretty clear that, you know, the use of these targeted sanctions against Venezuelan officials haven't really been seen by most Venezuelans as an attack on them or something that's really aggravating the economy. Instead, the effect has been, as I said, to sort of ensure the loyalty of these officials and complicate some kind of eventual transition.
Yeah. Interestingly, I think, I stand to be corrected, under the Obama administration, they did not use the word dictator, either when talking about Hugo Chavez or Maduro. The Treasury Secretary used the word dictator and used the word dictatorship here. I wonder what your take is on this. The country is clearly in trouble. There's trouble on the streets. The economy is in free fall. There's a lot of violence and a lot of instability. Is it just because of bad kind of Chavismo economic policies which led to the economic trouble and the social troubles? Or do you agree with the Treasury Secretary that under Maduro, they're tampering with the democratic institutions, that they're messing with the democratic fundamentals of the country, and that this is no longer a democracy and it is a dictatorship? Is it one or the other or both?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you talk to people, I mean, the issue is extremely polarized. If you talk to people in the Venezuelan government, they tell you that, Venezuela is a shining example of direct democracy. And if you talk to people in the Venezuelan opposition, they'll try to get you to say that Venezuela is a narco-terrorist dictatorship. And I think the reality is we can definitely say that Venezuela is no longer a democracy. They've been undergoing a very clear authoritarian slide over the last 2 years. But I think, there are these institutions in place that have functioned democratically previously in the not-so-distant past. And, I am hopeful that those institutions can be restored.
And how can they be restored?
Well, I think we need to see some kind of internationally mediated process of meaningful negotiations between the government and the opposition. Right now, that's sort of complicated because the Venezuelan opposition is notoriously divided. But I believe on Wednesday of this week, we're going to see talks take place in the Dominican Republic. That is to say, both sides are going to sit down and look at things like electoral conditions and the prospect for some kind of change. And I think that's a really important step to watch. And as we talk about sanctions, I mean, that's one thing that I'm really concerned about is these targeted sanctions against Venezuelan officials, I think, could complicate some kind of transition. There's also U.S. sanctions against issuing new debt against Venezuela, which is complicating their attempts to renegotiate their debt at the moment and avoid a default.
Yeah, and that just might lead Venezuela to double down and make it near impossible for any proper mediated, meaningful talks. Jeff Ramsey, complicated situation in Venezuela. Thanks for helping us demystify some of it from DC.